All right. Let's start. Can you guys see my screen now? Yeah. All right. So let's start. So this week, the topic is on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In short form, we call it ADAS. So in this particular topic, you should be able to explain what determines aggregate demand, what determines aggregate supply. Uh, you should be able to explain the macroeconomic equilibrium both in the short run and in the long run. And you should be also able to explain the effects of changes in aggregate demand and supply on real GDP and the price level. Then you should be able to use the ADAS model to explain economic growth, inflation, and business cycles. So the economic activities fluctuates from one year to another year. It does not remain the same. So it keeps on fluctuating from one year to another year. So there are three key facts about economic fluctuations. First of which is that economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. So economic fluctuations come in irregular periods, and it is not so easy to predict the fluctuations either. But sometimes there are people who predict it, and it is quite known in sometimes, but in most of the cases, it is quite unpredictable. And the fluctuations in the economy are often called as business cycle, as we have covered in the previous lecture. And a recession is a period of declining incomes and rising unemployment. So typically in a recession, there are declining incomes and rising unemployments. A depression is a severe recession. So the last depression was in 1930s. Secondly, most macroeconomic quantities fluctuate together. So most economic variables that measures some type of income or production fluctuate closely together. So either it's GDP or unemployment or any such thing or aggregate demand. So those things fluctuate together due to the business cycles. So even though they fluctuate together, they fluctuate in different amounts. So for example, in a recession, the impact on one variable could be higher than the impact on another variable. So the fluctuation level in amount might differ. Thirdly, as output falls, unemployment rises. So as we have seen in the previous lecture, during the recessions, we see that the unemployment rates rise substantially in every recession because there is a fall in output level or the production level of the economy. So look at the basic model of economic fluctuations. We use two variables to develop a model to analyze short-run fluctuations. One of which is the economy's output of goods and services measured by the real GDP. So we use the output level of an economy. Then the other one is the overall price level. In other words, it is the inflation rate which is measured by CPI or GDP deflator. So in the macroeconomic model, we use these two variables, that is the overall price level and the economy's total output level. In industry level or firm level, we use two other variables, that is the price of a particular product and the quantity of the particular product. So economists use model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to explain short-run fluctuations in economic activity around its long-run trend. So potential output are beyond the fluctuations. The uh, explained Puram we use ADAS model. So this is basically uh, so the aggregate demand curve shows the quantity of goods and services that households, firms, and the government want to buy at each inflation rate. So you guys will remember from the microeconomics part, uh, the demand curve has price in on the vertical axis, but at the macroeconomic level, the total aggregate demand curve has inflation rate at the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have quantity of output or the GDP level on the x-axis. In microeconomics level, for example, a demand for a singular product, there we write the quantity of that particular product. So basically, aggregate means summing up. Summing up of things is aggregate. So aggregate demand curve shows the demand for all goods and services produced within the country over a period of time. Similar to this, the aggregate supply curve shows the quantity of goods and services which are being produced and sold by firms at each inflation rate. So inflation rate quantity supply puri relationship में බලන්නේ from aggregate supply curve. So looking into more detail of the aggregate demand curve, the aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the aggregate price level or the inflation rate and the quantity of aggregate output demanded by households, businesses, and the government. So on the x-axis we have the total aggregate output or the real GDP, and on the y-axis we have the general price level measured in inflation rate. So it shows the negative relationship between aggregate output and the price level. So when the general price levels fall in an economy, then the quantity of goods and services demanded rises in the economy. Similar to in a singular products industry. So in a single firm, when the prices falls, the quantity demanded increases. So the same concept here, but with the general price level and the overall output level. So some warnings. So aggregate demand curve is not a market demand curve, and it is not the sum of all market demand curves in the economy. It is a more complex concept. So we cannot use ceteris paribus assumption to draw the aggregate demand curve, because when the overall prices rise, many prices, including input prices, rise together. Yeah. So if the overall price level of the economy is rising, then we cannot actually keep constant the for example other things such as the input prices. So because of that, the aggregate demand concept is much complex compared to a singular market demand curve. So aggregate demand falls when price level increases, because the higher price level causes the demand for money to rise, which causes interest rate to rise. So when there is a rise in prices, which will lead for more demand for money. So if meaning if the prices rise, you will demand for your wages to be increased. So once the demand for money increases, the banks will also increase their lending interest rates. So because of that, when the interest rates increases, it leads there will be fewer people who can borrow at higher interest rates. So because of that, there will be low consumption, low investment, and such, and then the aggregate demand will fall because of that. Yeah, so it is the higher interest rate that causes aggregate output to fall in the end. So at all points along the aggregate demand curve, both goods market and the money market are at the equilibrium. So aggregate demand curve කොම්ම point එක ගවස් the goods market money market equilibrium ga mihunani e mi level ge money ga kihawarege goods etto demand kurani. So that's the thing shown there. So how do we derive the aggregate demand curve? Yes, Samir, what is it? No, I am already recording it and I will be giving you guys the video. If you press the button again, it will stop my recording. Yes, Cypher. Yes, only one can record it. Yep, you can record from any other app, but if you start to record from this Google Meet, then it will stop from my end. All right, so how do we derive aggregate demand curve? There are four components of GDP. In other words, GDP is represented by the letter Y. So there are four components of GDP which contributes to aggregate demand for goods and services. So can anybody tell me what is the these four components? What are the four components of GDP from expenditure approach? Anybody? Yeah, one of which is investment. The other one is net exports, consumption. What else? Government expenditure. Yes, very good. So GDP consists of consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. The net exports is the exports minus imports figure. So at every point along the aggregate demand curve, the aggregate quantity of output demanded is exactly equal to the planned aggregate expenditure. Now, so planned aggregate total expenditure level everwegen dan aggregate demand curve ge komme point ekka wes in output level. So we assume there are no changes in government spending, so net success, or the monetary policy variable, so which could be the money supply. The main reason why we keep these, we assume these keep unchanged is because government does not react the same way to changes in prices as other economic participants does. So even though there are rises in prices, the government might not reduce their demand. So government does not act the same way as other economic participants. To understand the slope of aggregate demand, we must determine how a change in price affects consumption, investment, and net exports. So there are three reasons why aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. First of which is because of the wealth effect. The wealth effect illustrates the relationship between the inflation rate and consumption. So basically it's saying is when there is a falling price level or when there is a falling inflation rate, it will increase the value of one's money portfolio. So because of that, so that means when there is a fall in general price level, same amount of money can buy more goods now. So because of that, consumers will feel more wealthy. So once they feel more wealthy, they will start to consume more. So that's the wealth effect. So when the prices falls, money demand will fall because with existing money you can buy more goods and services. So when the money demand falls, there will be a falling interest rates. So misalaka bank mihun loan naga minwaruda davwamun dakamuga warnama banks in emihunge interest rates dakkura. Dakkurima now it will be cheaper to borrow even. So because of that borrowing is consumption increase again. So these are two roots of wealth effect and how the inflation and consumption are related. The second type is the interest rate effect. It shows the relationship between inflation rate and investments. So when there is a falling interest inflation rate, it will increase the value of cash holdings and thus reduce the interest rates. So there will be greater spending on investment goods. So basically, when the price level falls, the money demand will fall again because now the existing cash holdings will be valued more than how it was previously. So when the money demand falls, the interest rate will fall again. So which will make borrowing cheaper for businesses. So they will borrow and invest in their businesses more. So there will be a boost in investment. The third type is so is this one should be exchange rate effect. So the third one is exchange rate effect, which shows the relationship between the inflation rate and net exports. So when there is a fall in price levels, it will reduce the interest rates as I have explained before. So when there is a fall in interest rates, the short-term capital inflows to the country will also fall. So because of that, there will be a lower demand for the currency of the country. When there is lower demand for the local currency, the real exchange rate of that currency will depreciate. So when the currency depreciates, it means that the goods produced in that particular country will be more cheaper for foreign countries. So because of that, there will be a stimulation in net exports. So exports ituru vegan. So basically, when prices fall, there will be lower demand for money, which will reduce the interest rates. Because of the reduction in interest rates, there will be lower demand for that particular country's currency, which will lead to depreciation in exchange rate, and then net exports will increase. For example, Rajyega, if the prices falls, Rajyega interest rates davvegen, දිවෙහි රුපියාගේ මේ depreciate වන. ඒක මාන්නේ කි ඩොලරක $8 මිහාරු ලිබේනේ කුරියව්වර ගින දිවෙහි රුපියා. Yeah. So for example, 1542 in there, if there is a depreciation to 16 rupiah per dollar, then misalka US ga huri miyaku rajyen එච්ච ගන්නන් බලාකම ගවානම he will be spending $1, but he will be getting goods worth of 16 rupiah now, as opposed to previous 15.42. So there will be so foreign countries ke mihun will demand for more goods from our country. So there will be a boost in the exports of the country. So looking at again the slope of the aggregate demand curve, so an increase in the price level reduces the quantity of goods and services demanded because of the wealth effect. Because when there is an increasing price level, when there is an increasing price level, the consumption falls. Also, there is interest rate effect, which leads to investments to fall, and also there is exchange rate effect, which leads to net exports to fall. So when there is increasing price level, the total goods and services demanded in the economy will fall. So these are showing how then the changes in inflation rate affects quantity of goods and services demanded. The quantity of goods and services demanded may change underneath because of a change in price level. So it is the movement along the aggregate demand curve. Because it is a change in price, which price is changing annayamu, which it causes a movement along the demand curve, the Fourier wave. So the same concept here, when there is a change in the price level, there is a movement along the aggregate demand curve. So just now I talked about what are the reasons why there is a movement along the demand curve, aggregate demand curve. So how and why can aggregate demand curve shift? So shift meaning when there is an event that changes consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net export other than price level, which will shift aggregate demand curve. So price level බදලෙන් අවුන්නු එහෙන් කමකා හැදි if the consumption, investment, government expenditure and net exports changes, then there will be a shift in aggregate demand curve. So one thing to remember here is that government expenditure there will be changes due to non-price factors, but price factors of government expenditure is prone. So the there will be no effect on government expenditure due to changes in price level. But due to other factors, the government expenditure might also change. So for example, a stock market boom makes households feel wealthier. So this is the change in some other factor other than the price level. So when the consumers feel wealthier, they will increase their consumption, leading to aggregate demand curve to shift to right. So looking into more detail of how there might be a shift in each of these cases. So first we will look into consumption. So consumption expenditures are usually connected to households, as I talked about in the previous lecture. So among the factors that affect or influence consumption are first is consumers' wealth. So when there is an increase in the consumer's wealth or income, then the consumer will consume more, which will lead to a shift in aggregate demand curve to the right. So because there is an increase in consumption, there is an increase in aggregate demand curve. So it will shift to right. The other one could be consumer expectations. So if they expect the future income of them to rise, then they will increase their consumption now even, which will lead to aggregate demand curve to shift to right. Also, if the consumers expect future inflation rate to go up, that means Korean prices much kama consumers expect kurakama gawanama miharu emihun consume kura minvaru ituru kuran a prices much diumo kuring avahan echi gannam. So that we saw at the start of this lockdown. No? So Actually, aku baca danikam bala people started to hoard. So there was a higher consumption and there was a shift in aggregate demand curve in that case. Then household debt. So when there is an increase in household debt, it will lead to lower consumptions. So because they will be spending more of their income to pay their debt, because of that there will be lower consumption and it will shift aggregate demand curve to left because aggregate demand double again. Then there's taxes. When the government increases taxes, for example, income tax implement Kurima, it will reduce the disposable income of consumers or households. So when the disposable income falls, it will the households will lower their consumption, leading to a shift in aggregate demand curve to left. Another factor is money supply. So when the money supply level in the economy increases, so money demand, money supply, economic hunda money level ni machadani, machadiyayima, there will be a decrease in interest rates because economic money gina people will not be demanding for that much borrowings. So because of that, banks will reduce interest rates. So when they reduce interest rates, it will be cheaper for people to borrow now. So because of that, they will borrow. For example, they will borrow to buy household furniture or a TV or whatsoever, and then the consumption will be higher now, leading to a shift in aggregate demand curve to right. Then, in terms of investments, investment expenditures are usually incurred by firms. So factors that influence investments are interest rates. So when there is an increase in interest rate, that means the cost of borrowing is now higher. So because of that, there will be lower investments and there will be a shift of aggregate demand curve to the left because aggregate demand double can be that. Then again, there are expectation related shifts. So, for example, if a firm is expecting their revenue to increase or their profit to increase in the future, then they will invest more now, leading to a shift in aggregate demand curve to the right. The same, similar to consumers or consumptions. Expected if the expected inflation is to rise, then they will consume more now. Kuriyan vettanaga prices ge agu macha diyo mo kuring miharu avang echi kane for noni invest koffa they will increase their investment now. So because of that, there will be a aggregate demand curve shift to the right. When there is a level of excess, when there is an increase in the excess capacity of a particular business or firm, if they have excess capacity, they will not invest more on future equipments or plant and machinery. So because of that, there will be a lower investment and it will shift aggregate demand curve to the left. So when there are increases in business taxes, for example, TGST, GST, business profit taxes, so this will actually leave with lower profits for businesses uh, to invest. So it will reduce the investments and shift aggregate demand curve to the left. Same here again with the money supply. So when there is an increase in money supply, there will be a reduction in interest rates leading to higher investments because the cost of borrowing is now lower. Then when there is an increase in investments, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. So another factor is technology. When there is an improvement in the technology, it will lower the investments and lead to aggregate demand curve to left. Because when there is technological improvements, that means you can do things more cheaply now. And then because of that, there will be lower investment on other things because technology Korea for example in machinery you might be able to do more things. So because of that waki machinery and invest kura member dabbegendan aerum the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right left. Then in terms of government expenditure, the changes in government expenditure and taxes result are a result of fiscal policy, and they can be either be expansionary fiscal policy, where if the government increases its expenses in providing infrastructure through expansionary fiscal policy, the aggregate demand curve will shift to right. So basically, expansionary fiscal policy means when the government increases their spending, so government spending through they will be buying more goods and services. So because of that, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Another way of expansionary fiscal policy is to reduce the taxes. So when they reduce taxes, the same impact will occur because businesses will uh, now have more money to for their investments, and households will have more money for their consumption, which will lead to aggregate demand curve to be shifted to rightwards. Another type of fiscal policy is contractionary fiscal policy. So we will go more into detail of these types of fiscal policy in the fiscal policy topic. So instead of if the government practices a contractionary policy, then aggregate demand curve will move to the left. That means if the government reduces their spending level or if they increase their taxes, then the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. Sorry, here it should be left. Okay. Then the fourth category is net exports. So the changes in exports connected to the movement of aggregate demand curve is influenced by factors other than price. So those are through foreign income. So when the income of foreigners are high, their demand is relatively high too, whether it is for domestic goods or foreign goods. So a foreign country, if their income rises, they will demand for more domestically produced goods or even imported goods. So because of that, the demand for foreign goods will increase, and it will increase the exports of the exporter country. For example, Rajang, we are exporting fish to Thailand or European market. So if the income rises in the European market or in Thailand, then there will be more demand for our fish exports, which will lead to an rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. So when there is an increase in foreign income, it will lead to exports to rise and aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Then another thing is exchange rate. So the deterioration in the value of rupiah, that means if the rupiah depreciates, then it will make Maldivian goods relatively cheaper compared to foreign goods for foreigners, not for locals, but for foreigners. So therefore, Maldives net exports will increase. So when the exchange rate depreciates, there will be an increase in the exports leading to aggregate demand curve to shift rightwards. So I have put some more details of those things. You can go through it later. Then now we are coming to aggregate supply curve. So previously we talked about aggregate demand curve. So the aggregate supply curve shows the total quantity of goods and services firms produce and sell at given price level. Komme inflation rate එක firms produce ko sell kura quantity of goods and services may represent කොද්දෙනි aggregate supply curve. So aggregate supply curve is upward sloping in the short run, but it is vertical in the long run. Yeah. So it is upward sloping in the short run and it is vertical in the long run. We will talk about why it is upward sloping in the short run and why it is vertical in the long run as well. So something before that, Cobb-Douglas aggregate production function. So we'll touch slightly on this. So in so these two people, they argued that an efficient developed economy generally produces more with the same quantity of capital and labor than an inefficient primate economy. So efficient economy, they will be producing more goods and services with the same level of capital and labor as compared to an inefficient economy. The share of labor and capital income in the United States economy have remained relatively constant over time at about 70% of labor and 30% of capital. So, based on these levels, Cobb-Douglas production function is actually derived. So, Cobb-Douglas production function incorporates these two ideas. That is, so this Y is the total production level or the GDP level. It is a function of the total capital and the total labor in the market, and now they put technology as well. Which is equal to A and K to the power 0.3 because 30% is capital and L to the power 0.7 because labor is 70%. So if there is if for example Maldives this share is different, then we will be putting Maldives ratios here to find our production level. So here the A represents total sector productivity. From the perspective of workers, labor productivity is the amount of output produced per unit of labor. So that means total output divided by total labor. So that is the labor productivity. So then, unlike labor productivity, total sector productivity takes into account how productive labor and capital are together. So එදේති එක්කොන් කිහා productive වෙත්තෝ economy as a total sector productivity in me represent කොතැනි. So to find the total sector productivity of a particular country, what you have to do is actually you have to rearrange this particular formula so that the total output will be divided by the relevant capital ratio and labor ratio. So that will be y divided by k to the power 0.3 into L to the power 0.7, which will give you the value of A or total sector productivity. So movement along the aggregate supply curve is when a change in output causes price level to change. We move along economy's aggregate supply curve. So one thing to remember here is that the price level change which causes a movement along aggregate supply is coming from a change in total output. That means there will be a change in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand curve shift වීම මේ change වෙන්නේ. I will show it in a while. So what happens in economy as we make such a move? So as we move upward along aggregate supply curve, we can represent what happens as follows. So when there is a increase in real GDP, that means there is a shift in aggregate demand curve. It will lead to two things. One of which is input requirements per unit of output will increase because the total output is now increasing. Then another thing is the prices of non-labor inputs. So the prices of non-labor inputs will also increase because of this, which will lead to increasing unit costs of production. Then because the unit cost increases, the firms will increase their prices they charge on consumers. So that's how it goes. So there is, as I have said, there is a short-run aggregate supply curve and a long-run aggregate supply curve. So first we will talk about the short-run aggregate supply curve. In the short run, aggregate supply curve has a positive slope. Yeah, so the it shows the relationship between the prices and output level. So when the price increases, we see that the output level is increasing in the aggregate supply curve. In the short run aggregate supply curve, that is because when the price overall price level increases, then the total amount of goods and services which the producers are willing to produce and supply increases. So one thing to remember is that at low levels of aggregate output, the curve is fairly flat. So when there is a low level of output, y0 and y1, the curve is quite flat. There a flat curve. So as the economy approaches full capacity, as it approaches the full capacity, the curve becomes nearly vertical. No, vertical as the quantity increases. So because of that, at the full capacity, the curve is vertical. And something to remember is in here, an increase in aggregate demand when the economy is operating at low levels of output is likely to result in an increase in output with little or no increase in the overall price level. So simply put, when we are operating at low levels of aggregate output, so dull level aggregate output if the aggregate demand shifts to rightward, if the aggregate demand shifts to rightward, we are seeing even though there is a huge increase in the output level, the price level is not increasing that much. But if we are in a if we are approaching the maximum capacity, or if we are producing goods at a, if we are having a more aggregate output level, a small change in aggregate output might result in a higher or a bigger change in the price level. As you can see here, from y2 to y3, you are seeing that the output level has not increased much, but the price level has increased significantly larger than how the output has increased. So when we are at the flat part of the aggregate supply curve, the change in output will lead to a smaller change in the price level, and the opposite happens when we are closer to the maximum capacity. That is that is mainly because the resources are being exhausted once you are approaching maximum capacity. At the lower levels of output, there will be even more resources you can actually employ to produce. But once there is a higher aggregate output level, there will be lower resources for that which you can use to increase the output. So because of that, the resources will be more costly now. So to fill up the cost they are having to incur, they are increasing the prices at this level. Then why does the short-run aggregate supply curve slope upwards? So there are three things, one of which is the new classical misperception theory. There are three theories. This is the first one. So the changes in overall inflation rate temporarily mislead suppliers about what is happening in the market in which they sell their output. A lower inflation rate causes misperceptions about relative prices. These misperceptions induce suppliers to decrease the quantity of goods and services supplied. So, because when there is a change in overall inflation rate and when there is a lower inflation rate, creates misperceptions about uh, what's happening in the market and what are the relative prices. So because of that, the suppliers might decrease their quantity of goods and services they supply. The other one is the Keynesian sticky wage theory. So this is uh, says that the nominal wages are slow to adjust or are sticky in the short run. In the short run, the wages do not adjust or do not change that much. So when wages do not adjust immediately to a fall in inflation rate, a lower inflation makes employment and production less profitable. Yeah, because what happens is even though there is a fall in the price level in the short run, wages might not fall that much. So it will be more costly for businesses to produce at this level because the prices they are having to charge from consumers is low, but they are having to give a higher rate. So it is not profitable or less profitable for uh, producers to produce because of this sticky wage theory. This induces firms to reduce the quantity of goods and services they supply. Then the third one is the sticky price theory. It says that the prices of some goods and services adjust sluggishly in response to changes economic conditions. So what it means is even though economic conditions change drastically, the price of some goods and services do not adjust that soon. So an unexpected fall in the inflation rate leaves some firms with higher than desired prices. So even though the overall general price level in the market falls unexpectedly, some firms might still be charging higher prices on the goods they uh, produce. So this depresses sales because overall price level people will not be demanding uh, for uh, uh, for product which are being sold at a higher price because they will be expecting the price of that good to also fall in the future. So they will be waiting until the prices fall. So because of that, the sales of the company will fall, which will lead for firms to reduce the quantity they produce because they have the sales Mohingati, they will reduce the quantity they are producing. So so in each case, what happens is when there is a decrease in the inflation rate, it will reduce the quantity of goods and services supplied in the short run. So that's why it is upward sloping because of these three theories. Then looking at the determinants of aggregate supply, higher input prices increase per unit production costs and reduce aggregate supply. So, for example, in the domestic resources, an increase in the supply of land resources lowers the price of land inputs, lowering price per costs and increases aggregate supply. Because when resources increase, then the price of that resource will fall. When the price of that resource falls, that means the cost of inputs are being reduced for businesses. When the cost of inputs fall, that means there will be a lower cost per unit and allowing businesses to actually produce more goods and services, which will increase aggregate supply. An increase in the availability of labor resource reduces the price of labor and increases aggregate supply. So same as land, when there are more people who are coming into the labor force, it will reduce the wages per labor, and because of that, is less cheaper for businesses to hire workers. so they can produce more good at a lower cost, which will increase the aggregate supply. When the prices of imported resources fall, also when there is a uh, reduction in the prices of imported resources, it will expand the nation's aggregate supply as well. Because again, it will be how many resources, whether it is domestic resources or imported resources. For example, if we are importing raw materials from abroad, and let's say this raw material is oil, if the oil prices fall, that means now we can produce the particular product that we are producing at a lower cost. So we can produce more at a lower cost, which will lead to a nation's aggregate supply to increase. The opposite will happen if the prices of the resources increase. So another thing which could affect the prices of imported resources is exchange rate fluctuations. So if our exchange rate depreciates, it means, for example, rupiah depreciate and now we will be having to spend more rupiah to buy dollars. That means Niharu Aharunna Berugaumuga products are more expensive. So Rajega produce Puramihe now they can produce lower amount of goods and services because the cost of inputs has increased. So because of that, they will reduce the aggregate supply in this case. The opposite will happen if our exchange rate appreciates. Aero misalaka mihar 15.42 rupiah appreciate vio it's at 12.85. Appreciate vejayamu now we can buy dollar at a lower price. So now our imports are cheaper compared to before, so we can produce more goods and services and aggregate supply will increase. Then the other one is changes in productivity. So productivity relates a nation's level of real output to the quantity of input used to produce that output. In other words, productivity is measured of average real output or of real output per unit of input. So from input productivity. In other words, it's the total factor productivity. No? So an increase in productivity means economy can obtain more real output from its limited resources and which will reduce its input costs. So productivity increase with the Kamagaravana. For example, if the labor force is being more productive, even though with the same amount of labor, we will be able to produce more goods and services. So that means the per unit cost is now falling. So because of that, there will be a change in aggregate supply. There will be increase in aggregate supply. The third one is changes in government policies. So one of which is business taxes and subsidies. When the government increases their business taxes, then that means they have to actually incur more cost per unit, and then because of that, it will reduce their aggregate supply. But on the other hand, if the government is giving businesses a subsidy as payments or let's say tax breaks, no tax reliefs, then it will reduce the production costs for businesses and increase the aggregate supply. Government regulation is another thing which could affect the aggregate supply level. So it is usually costly for businesses to comply with government regulations. For example, carbon footprint level dakpuram by government. So eco-friendly, carbon-friendly materials or equipments are actually more expensive as of now. So because of that, in order to adhere to the regulation, they will have to incur a higher cost. So because of that, the aggregate supply will fall or shift leftwards. So, supply side proponents has said deregulation will reduce cost per unit and shift aggregate supply curve rightward. So Mikahala regulations the Wadafikamagavarnama. It will reduce the cost per unit and shift the aggregate supply curve to the rightwards or increase aggregate supply. Fourth one is changes in environment. So environment induces weather, includes weather, natural disasters, and wars. Environment factors such as natural disasters can cause increase in the cost of production. For example, if there are hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, earthquakes, or droughts, which could actually cause aggregate supply, short-term aggregate supply to shift to leftward. Uh, these are mainly called supply shocks. We call unexpected events which causes supply to shift leftward is called leftward or even rightward is called a supply shock. Misalaka, let's say uh, India in the rainy season, so it is a natural cause. So in the natural when it rains heavily, actually there are flooding and their farmers' lands are actually destroyed, causing a lot of crops to be unused. So in that case, we see that the prices of vegetables are increasing in India during this rainy season. And the same impact we can see in the Maldives as well. So because we import a lot of vegetables from India, such as onions, so when they're when in the during the rainy season, onion production level goes down and the onion prices increases. We can see in the Maldives even during August, September, October, this period, the onion prices increase. So a leftward shift of the short-term aggregate supply curve is caused by cost shocks. No, cost shocks ke sabon it will cause the short-term aggregate supply curve to shift left. A decrease in costs, economic growth, or public policy can cause rightward shift of the short-term aggregate supply curve, as I have explained. So these are the things I have explained before, so you can go through these again in more detail. So now we will talk about the long-run aggregate supply curve. In the long run, the aggregate supply curve is vertical at the natural rate of output. Yeah. So this is the natural rate of output. In other words, the natural rate of output is the potential output level. Yeah. Potential output curve Puri lecture I showed to you guys. So the natural rate of output is the potential output. So at the potential output level, the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical. This level of production is also referred as potential output level or full employment output. So at the potential output level, there will be full employment, as we have gone through in the previous lecture. In the long run, an economy's production of goods and services depends on its supply of resources used to turn these vectors of production into goods and services. So long run, the production will depend on actually how much resources are available rather than the price of a particular. So price of a product, price in the short run, the price affects the amount of goods and services which are being produced and supplied by the businesses. But in the long run, the price does not play a role, but the long run supply is determined by the resources available. So because of that, the inflation rate does not affect these variables in the long run. So as you can see in here, even though there is a change in the interest rate from pi 1 to pi 2, it does not affect the goods and services supplied in the long run, and it is a vertical curve. At any given price level, in the long run, the amount of aggregate supply will be remaining the same. So long run average supply curve is vertical because it is independent of price, as I have just said before. So the reason why it is independent of the price is if there is a change in the general price level of goods and services, a proportionate change in wage rate will also occur. Yeah? So in the long run, what happens is if there is an increase in the price level, there will be an equivalent level of increase in the wage rate. So which will leave with when the price level changes and the relative price level remains constant, the real GDP also remains constant. Because if there is a price increase by let's say 10%, accompanied by a 10% rise in wages, that means even though the prices are increasing by 10%, your income level has also increased by 10%. So you can afford the same level of output at this level because there is a 10% increase in prices and 10% increase in your wage even or the wage rate. So overall, the impact will remain constant and the real GDP will also remain constant at that level. So that is why the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical and independent of the price. Then why might long run aggregate supply curve shift rightwards or leftwards? So the natural rate of output YN is the amount of output that the economy produces when the unemployment is at its natural rate. When the unemployment is at natural rate, we call it to be full employment. No? So at the natural rate of output, we will be having full employment and it is also the potential output of the economy. So any event that changes any of the determinants of uh, the potential output will shift the long run average supply curve. For example, let's say, as I have said before, in the long run, the potential supplies and other things will depend on the resources available. So if in the long run there's an immigration of laborers. So if there's an immigration of people into the country, that means the overall labor force of the market will increase. So there will be more labor to produce goods and services. So when that happens, that means the PPF now will be able to move out of the PPF curve. So PPF ಬೇರೆ in a point we have reached revenue because of improvement in the availability of resources. So this will raise the long run uh, uh, average supply or the natural rate of output even. Because now the natural rate of output will be changing because of this. So that's why there might be a change in shift in aggregate supply curve to the right in this case, in this example. Then we'll talk about the macroeconomic equilibriums. First, we will highlight on the short term. Yes. Sorry, Razna. Yes. I am thinking of. We don't have much slides now, so I'm thinking of actually finishing the slides and ending the class sooner. So in the short run, macroeconomic equilibrium occurs uh, when the quantity of real GDP demanded equals the quantity of real GDP supplied. That means quantity of output demanded, overall output demanded is equal to the quantity of output supplied. So the short run equilibrium occurs when the aggregate demand curve intersects with the short run aggregate supply curve. Yeah. So This is when the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium occurs. So in the short run, money, wage rate, and other factors prices are fixed. As I have said, in the short run, there are sticky wages and sticky prices. No? So this is the how the short-term macroeconomic equilibrium occurs. It is aggregate demand curve will be the same, but the short-term there are two supply curves: a short-term supply curve and a long-term supply curve. So aggregate demand curve, short-term aggregate supply curve intersect vairuga, which gives us the short-term macroeconomic equilibrium. So at any point in the short-term aggregate supply curve, uh, if their output is at any point above the short-term macroeconomic equilibrium, then the farms will cut down their prices and cut down their production and reduce the price, and we will reach to the equilibrium. And if at any point the production level is below the short-term macro equilibrium, then the farms will increase their production and increase the prices as well. So in the long run equilibrium occurs when real GDP equals potential GDP. So that is the long run macro equilibrium. So equivalently, when the economy is on its long run aggregate supply curve. As I have explained in the previous slides, the long run aggregate supply curve is the potential GDP level. So in the long run equilibrium is when the aggregates demand equals aggregate demand meaning the real GDP, aggregate demand curve meyangadeni real GDP. So when the real GDP equals the potential GDP, that's when the long run equilibrium occurs. So the long run equilibrium comes about because money, wage rate, and other factor prices adjust. So in the long run, there will be adjustments in the wage rate and the other factor prices. So potential GDP and aggregate demand determine the price level, and price level influences money, wage rate. So in here, the why not represents the level of output that can be sustained in the long run without uh, inflation. So that is long run aggregate supply curve. Nuniyamu potential output level midakkaleni by zeroing, or another name for that is the full employment level, nuni natural rate of unemployment. At the natural rate of unemployment, if you guys remember, there will be no, it is non-accelerating inflation rate at that level. So Y0 we represent for the potential output. So output can be pushed above potential GDP by higher aggregate demand. So when the aggregate demand actually shifts rightward, that means the real GDP is now performing higher than the potential GDP level. Yeah. So now we are seeing that the aggregate demand has shifted, but because of that, in the short run, what happens is the prices are rising because at the point where the aggregate demand curve is equal to the short run aggregate supply curve, then the prices are now increasing compared to before as the uh, output has increased. When the output pushed above the potential, there is upward pressure on the costs as well. So, because the price, as I have said, general price level machadiyayima, input prices will also be increasing. So firms will have to incur more costs in the short run to produce those goods and services. So because they are having to incur more costs, they will reduce the amount of goods and services they are producing, which will cause a shift in the aggregate supply curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve to leftwards. So it goes back to the long run aggregate supply curve point where it goes back to the potential GDP, and you can see again the aggregate supply, the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply is equal at this point, but at a cost. Now the price level has increased from previous P0 to P1. Yeah. So even though we end up at the potential output level, now the price level is increased in this case. So this is the same thing explaining more in detail with numbers. You can go through it later. So now we will talk about economic growth and how it is related to inflation, and or how growth leads to inflation. So economic growth occurs because over time there is increase in labor quantity, capital is accumulated, and technology advances. Hence, aggregate supply shifts right now. Yeah. So because in the previous lecture I have said that the economic growth occurs because we of more efficiency of the resources we have. If we have more resources, then we can experience economic growth. Then it is PPF outward shifting out. Same is that I have just said during the previous slides that the long run average aggregate supply curve might shift when there are changes in the number of available resources. So when economic growth occurs, we are seeing that the long run aggregate supply has shifted, and also the aggregate demand has also shifted in here. So inflation occurs because aggregate demand increases more than the increase in the aggregate supply. So if when in during an economic growth there is an output increase, the production level increases, and also the demand for goods and services increases. But if the demand for goods and services increase more than the increase in the supply level, then we will experience inflation. එක माना कि output increase sorry, production level increase demand level will increase when product. So now there is excess demand, which will lead to inflation or higher prices in general. So the real GDP fluctuates around the potential GDP in business cycle, and inflation also fluctuates during that. So we'll talk about business cycle and how it relates. So business cycle in we observe currently how the aggregate demand curve fluctuates around around the potential level, the potential GDP. So business cycle is observed because aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply fluctuates, but money, wage, and other factors do not adjust quickly enough to keep real GDP at full employment level. Yeah. So in the short run, what happens is there are changes in aggregate demand, there are changes in short run aggregate supply as well. But because we have sticky wages and sticky prices, which do not adjust as quickly as the demand and the supply level, uh, it will to keep the real GDP at a full employment level. So a short-term macroeconomic equilibrium in which the GDP is less than the potential GDP is called below full employment. So the long-run aggregate supply curve shows the potential GDP level. So if this output level is lower than this the potential output level, then we are below full employment equilibrium. Yeah. So in this one you can see that the real GDP, the potential GDP is 900 billions of dollars, but as you can see in here, the short-term equilibrium has occurred at the lower quantity. That means we are actually below the full employment equilibrium, and there is a mismatch between the potential output and the real GDP in this case. So the real GDP, as the real GDP is lower than the potential GDP, we are having a recessionary gap in this case. Then during the situation of full employment, the real GDP is equal to the potential GDP, and there is full employment. So here you see that the short-run aggregate supply and the short-run aggregate demand is having the equilibrium point, which also equals to the potential output level or the long-run aggregate supply curve. So all three are equating at this point. So this is the long-run equilibrium, or we are operating at the full employment level where we are achieving the potential GDP level. Then the third type could be when the economy is performing above full employment level. So as you can see here, the short-run aggregate demand curve and the aggregate demand curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve is equating at the $920 billion. So that means the real GDP is now $920 billion, meaning that is above the potential GDP of $900 billion. So when the real GDP is above the potential GDP, we call it that the gap between these two is the inflationary gap. So here is the curve. Let's see, in terms of fluctuations of real GDP or the business cycle. So as you can see here, the black line is the potential GDP, or the long run aggregate supply curve will also be at this level. So here you can see at the point A, that is the what will we call this in a business cycle? The point A. Can anybody tell me? The point A on the graph. What will it be called in the business cycle? Yeah, it is a trough. No? It is a trough. So at the trough, that is after a recession, the lowest point of recession is the trough. So at that point, we are seeing that the actual real GDP is lower than the potential GDP, which creates a recessionary gap. Then after trough, we are seeing that there is an expansionary period and the real GDP is now growing. Then when the real GDP is equal to the potential GDP, that is full employment level. Then we have an expansionary period and we have the peak at this particular point C. So what is it? At point C, what do we call it in business cycle? The point C, anybody? Yeah. So it is peak. No, that is the peak of the expansion. So at any point where the actual real GDP is above the potential GDP, we are experiencing an inflationary gap. So at any point where the real GDP is below the potential GDP, we are having a recessionary gap. Then one last thing before ending. So fluctuations in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So increasing money wage rate results in a decrease in aggregate supply, and short-term aggregate supply curve shift leftward, because when the wages increases, what happens is that the firms will now have to incur more cost. So because they have to incur more cost, they will reduce the amount they are supplying. So there will be a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. So now the equilibrium is at a higher point in terms of price level, and also the real GDP is now lower than the potential GDP level of long run aggregate supply curve, which was before. So this creates a recession because potential GDP over real GDP it creates a recession. On the other hand, the price level is also increasing in this case, as you can see. Yeah. So, which there is an inflation there. So, when these two things occur at the same time, we call it stagflation. Yeah. So, it does not happen all the time. Sometimes, if we go back to uh, this particular one, we can see that the price level is let's say quite at the same point. If but in this one we are seeing that when the GDP falls, the inflation is also rising. So when there is a recession, the recession meaning the GDP, real GDP is below the potential GDP level, then at the same time there is also inflation, meaning the general price levels of the economy has rise. So the combination of inflation and recession at the same time is called stagflation. So keep that in mind. Then policymakers response to recession in two ways, in two main ways. One of which is doing nothing and wait for prices and wages to adjust on its own. The another one is taking action to increase aggregate demand by using monetary policy or fiscal policy. Yeah. So once they use monetary policy or so let's say when the short so from the chart you can see that when the short-run aggregate supply falls, what happens is now the real GDP is below the potential GDP level, and the price level has also increased. So now the policy makers will either impose monetary policy measures or fiscal policy measures or both types of measures at the same time to actually boost the aggregate demand. So due to that, the aggregate demand curve is shifting rightwards. So now our new equilibrium is back to the potential GDP level, but it causes the inflation to rise further, even before then, even more than the previous level. But it will keep the output level at the natural rate. So we will talk more on the monetary policy and fiscal policy in the next unit. And I have put some videos for you guys to watch, and that's it for the presentation. If anybody has any questions, please let me know. Yeah, yes, I am now sending the attendance sheet. And in meantime, if you have any question, please let me know. More questions?